David stood in my office last Tuesday, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "You'll thank me for this someday." Then he walked out with everything I'd ever built. My own brother, my best friend since childhood, my business partner for 15 years, gone. I'm sitting here now in what used to be our shared empire. Empty desks, disconnected phones, legal papers scattered everywhere like the remnants of a tornado. The silence is deafening. And for the first time in my life, I'm completely, utterly alone. You probably know my name from Forbes. You've seen the headlines about our tech company, the IPO that made us both millionaires before we turned 30. What you haven't seen is this: me, broken, staring at a framed photo of two kids sharing a bicycle because we couldn't afford two. That was us. That was David and me. We built our first computer in Mom's basement when I was 16 and he was 14. While other kids were playing video games, we were creating them. While they were dating, we were debugging code until 3 a.m., fueled by stolen energy drinks and this crazy dream that we could change the world together. Brothers forever, we used to say. We even got matching tattoos when we turned 18. Stupid, maybe, but it meant everything to us then. That tattoo burns like acid on my arm right now. See, what David did wasn't just theft. Anyone can steal money, clients, or ideas. What he did was surgical, personal, devastating in a way that only someone who knows your every weakness, every fear, every vulnerable spot can execute. He didn't just take our business, he took my identity. For 6 months, he'd been meeting with our biggest clients behind my back. For 6 months, he'd been copying files, rerouting emails, building relationships that excluded me entirely. For 6 months, my own brother had been systematically erasing me from the company I'd created. The worst part, I handed him the keys to do it. I gave him my passwords, my signature authority, my complete trust. When he suggested I take that well-deserved vacation to Hawaii last month, I actually thanked him for looking out for my mental health. I was in paradise while he was planning my professional execution. But here's what really haunts me, and this is the part that's going to sound crazy. I still love him. Even now, even after everything, I'd take him back if he walked through that door and said he was sorry. That's how sick family loyalty can make you. The phone call that ended everything came at 6:47 a.m., Hawaiian time. Our lawyer, stammering, trying to explain that I'd been legally removed from my own company. David filed the paperwork, he kept saying. David has controlling interests now. David, David, David. My brother had turned my own generosity into a weapon and aimed it directly at my heart. I flew back that same day. 22 hours of pure hell, knowing that everything I'd worked for, everything we'd built together, was being stripped away while I was trapped at 30,000 feet with nothing but my thoughts and a growing sense of dread. When I walked into his office building, the security guard who'd known me for 10 years asked for my ID. My keycard didn't work. My nameplate was already gone. But this story isn't about losing everything to the person you trusted most. This story is about what happens after the betrayal, after the lawsuits, after the sleepless nights wondering how someone you die for could destroy you so completely. This story is about discovering that sometimes the person who breaks you is also the person who shows you exactly how strong you really are. Over the next 10 chapters, I'm going to tell you exactly how David did it. Every calculated move, every lie, every moment I should have seen it coming but didn't. I'm going to share the legal documents, the text messages, the recorded phone calls that prove just how deep this betrayal went. But more than that, I'm going to show you how I'm building something even bigger from the ashes he left behind. If you've ever been betrayed by family, if you've ever trusted the wrong person, if you've ever wondered how to survive when your whole world implodes, this story is for you. Hit that like button if you believe loyalty should mean something.
Tell me in the comments about a time someone you loved let you down, because I know I'm not the only one carrying these scars. And subscribe, because the next 9 chapters of this story will shock you, inspire you, and maybe even save you from making the same mistakes I did. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the secret David kept for 2 years. The one thing that would have changed everything if I'd known. The thing that proves this wasn't greed. It was something much, much worse.
I keep replaying that Tuesday morning, looking for signs I missed. David walked into my office wearing his lucky red tie, the one he'd worn to every major presentation since college. His coffee was still steaming, and he had that familiar crooked smile that used to make me feel like we could conquer anything together. "Morning, partner," he said, just like he had every day for 15 years. But something felt different about the way he said partner, like he was savoring the word, rolling it around his mouth one last time before spitting it out forever. We talked about the Henderson account, our biggest client, worth $12 million annually. David seemed unusually focused on the details, asking questions about access codes and client contact information. I thought he was being thorough. Now I realize he was making a checklist. The strangest moment came when he hugged me goodbye. David wasn't a hugger, never had been, not since we were kids. But that Tuesday, he grabbed me in this fierce embrace that lasted just a beat too long. I felt his chest rise and fall against mine, heard him whisper something I couldn't quite catch. "What did you say?" I asked, pulling back to look at his face. "Nothing important," he replied. But his eyes were already distant, already seeing a future that didn't include me. I watched him walk toward the elevator, his shoulders set with unusual determination. The doors closed, and I went back to my desk, completely unaware that I'd just said goodbye to my brother for the last time as an equal, as a partner, as someone he still pretended to love. That afternoon, I noticed small things that should have alarmed me. David's assistant cleaning out her desk, the IT guy updating security protocols without my authorization, a meeting on my calendar that I didn't remember scheduling, lunch with our lawyer marked urgent discussion. But I was distracted by excitement. The IPO documents were finally ready for review. We were about to become richer than we'd ever dreamed. I spent the day imagining how we'd celebrate. Maybe take that trip to Japan we'd always talked about. Buy matching Ferraris like the ridiculous, successful brothers we'd become. I texted David around 3. "Want to grab dinner tonight? Celebrate before the chaos begins tomorrow?" He read the message immediately. I saw the 3 dots appear, disappear, appear again. Finally, he replied, "Rain check. Got some things to handle tonight." Now I know what he was handling. While I was planning our celebration, he was putting the final touches on my destruction. While I was dreaming about our shared future, he was already living in a world where I no longer existed.
The last thing I remember about that Tuesday was falling asleep with a smile on my face, thinking about how far we'd come from those 2 kids sharing a bicycle. I slept peacefully, completely trusting, completely naive. It was the last good night's sleep I'd have for months. The Hawaii phone call still gives me nightmares. I can hear every word with crystal clarity. The lawyer's stammering voice, the way he kept clearing his throat, the sound of waves outside my hotel room that suddenly seemed mocking instead of peaceful. "I'm afraid there's been a development with the company structure," he said, and I knew immediately that my life was about to implode. David had filed emergency paperwork claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit to run the company. He'd submitted doctor's notes I'd never seen, citing stress-related episodes I'd never had. He'd gathered statements from employees about my erratic behavior, employees who'd smiled at me just days before. The most devastating part was the psychiatric evaluation. David had somehow convinced a doctor that I was having a breakdown, that I posed a risk to the company and our investors. The signature on the authorization form was mine, but I had no memory of signing it. How is this possible? I kept asking, my voice cracking like I was 14 again, asking Mom why Dad had to leave us. Your brother has temporary controlling interest until you can prove mental competency, the lawyer explained. It's actually quite common in family businesses when one partner becomes unstable. I hung up and threw my phone against the hotel wall, the screen spider-webbed, reflecting my face in broken fragments. That's when it hit me, David hadn't just stolen the business. He'd stolen my sanity, my reputation, my very identity as a competent human being. I called every number I could remember. Our clients, our employees, our investors. Most calls went straight to voicemail. The few people who answered spoke to me like I was fragile, dangerous, someone to be handled with kid gloves. Maybe you should take some time off, our biggest client suggested gently. David explained everything. We understand you're going through a difficult period. David explained everything. David had a story ready for everyone. David had painted me as the unstable brother having a public breakdown while he heroically held the company together. I booked the next flight home, my hands shaking as I typed my credit card information. 22 hours of hell stretched ahead of me. But all I could think about was getting home, walking into that office and making everyone see that I was fine, that David was lying, that this was all some horrible mistake. During the flight, I obsessed over every detail I could remember. Had I seemed unstable? Had I made erratic decisions? Had I given David ammunition to use against me without realizing it? By the time we landed, I'd convinced myself that maybe I had been acting strangely. Maybe David was protecting the company from my poor judgment. Maybe I really was having some kind of breakdown and just couldn't see it. That's the insidious thing about betrayal. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself.
The last thing I remember about that Tuesday was falling asleep with a smile on my face, thinking about how far we'd come from those two kids sharing a bicycle. I slept peacefully, completely trusting, completely naive. It was the last good night's sleep I'd have for months. The Hawaii phone call still gives me nightmares. I can hear every word with crystal clarity. The lawyer's stammering voice, the way he kept clearing his throat, the sound of waves outside my hotel room that suddenly seemed mocking instead of peaceful. "I'm afraid there's been a development with the company structure," he said, and I knew immediately that my life was about to implode. David had filed emergency paperwork claiming I was mentally unstable and unfit to run the company. He'd submitted doctor's notes I'd never seen, citing stress-related episodes I'd never had. He'd gathered statements from employees about my erratic behavior, employees who'd smiled at me just days before. The most devastating part was the psychiatric evaluation. David had somehow convinced a doctor that I was having a breakdown, that I posed a risk to the company and our investors. The signature on the authorization form was mine, but I had no memory of signing it. How is this possible? I kept asking, my voice cracking like I was 14 again, asking Mom why Dad had to leave us. Your brother has temporary controlling interest until you can prove mental competency, the lawyer explained. It's actually quite common in family businesses when one partner becomes unstable. I hung up and threw my phone against the hotel wall, the screen spider-webbed, reflecting my face in broken fragments. That's when it hit me, David hadn't just stolen the business. He'd stolen my sanity, my reputation, my very identity as a competent human being. I called every number I could remember. Our clients, our employees, our investors. Most calls went straight to voicemail. The few people who answered spoke to me like I was fragile, dangerous, someone to be handled with kid gloves. Maybe you should take some time off, our biggest client suggested gently. David explained everything. We understand you're going through a difficult period. David explained everything. David had a story ready for everyone. David had painted me as the unstable brother having a public breakdown while he heroically held the company together. I booked the next flight home, my hands shaking as I typed my credit card information. 22 hours of hell stretched ahead of me. But all I could think about was getting home, walking into that office and making everyone see that I was fine, that David was lying, that this was all some horrible mistake. During the flight, I obsessed over every detail I could remember. Had I seemed unstable? Had I made erratic decisions?
Had I given David ammunition to use against me without realizing it? By the time we landed, I'd convinced myself that maybe I had been acting strangely. Maybe David was protecting the company from my poor judgment. Maybe I really was having some kind of breakdown and just couldn't see it. That's the insidious thing about betrayal. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself.
Walking into what used to be our building felt like entering a parallel universe where I was the villain in my own story. The security guard, Jerry, who'd known me since our startup days, looked at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "I need to see some ID, sir," he said, and the word "sir" felt like a knife between my ribs. My key card had been deactivated. My nameplate was gone from the directory. My parking spot had been reassigned. Every trace of my existence had been systematically erased while I was sipping Mai Tais on a beach in paradise. David was in a board meeting when I arrived. My board meeting, discussing my company's future without me. Through the glass conference room walls, I could see him gesturing confidently, speaking to investors who nodded along with his every word. He looked up and saw me standing there, and for just a moment, his mask slipped. I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Not guilt, not regret, but satisfaction. When the meeting ended, David approached me like a concerned caretaker addressing a confused patient. "Hey, brother," he said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder that felt heavy with false compassion. "I was hoping we could talk privately about your situation. My situation. As if my professional execution was just an unfortunate circumstance, like bad weather or a flat tire." We went to what used to be my office. David had already moved his things in. My words were gone from the walls, replaced by his diplomas and certifications. My family photos had been boxed up and stacked in the corner like evidence from a crime scene. "The doctors say you need time to recover," he said, settling into my chair like he'd been born to sit there. "The stress of the IPO, the long hours, it's taken a toll on your mental health." "What doctors, David? I never saw any doctors." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were pages of medical documentation, psychological evaluations, even a prescription for antidepressants I'd never taken. Everything looked official, legitimate, terrifyingly thorough.
"Dr. Morrison has been very concerned about your state of mind," David said. "The paranoid thoughts, the erratic decision-making, the mood swings that scared the employees." I stared at the papers, feeling reality tilt sideways. Either I was losing my mind, or my brother had orchestrated the most elaborate gaslighting campaign in corporate history. "I arranged for your voluntary admission to Serenity Hills. It's a beautiful facility, very discreet. You can get the help you need while I handle things here." That's when I understood the true genius of David's plan. He hadn't just stolen the company, he'd created a narrative where stealing it was an act of mercy, where I would be grateful for his intervention, where fighting back would only prove his point about my instability. What do you do when the person who knows you best uses that knowledge to destroy everything you are? I spent that first night in a hotel room, surrounded by legal documents spread across every surface like the remnants of my former life. Each page revealed another layer of David's meticulous planning, another moment when I'd been trusting while he'd been plotting. The earliest document dated back 2 years, a psychological consultation David had initiated, claiming concern for my increasing stress levels. He'd convinced me it was for our company's insurance policy, a standard executive wellness check. I'd sat in that doctor's office for an hour, talking about work pressures and family dynamics, never knowing that David was building a case against me with every word I spoke. Then came the employee statements. My assistant Linda had apparently documented several instances of my concerning behavior. The time I'd snapped at her for scheduling conflicts, normal workplace frustration, had become evidence of explosive anger issues.
My late nights at the office were characterized as obsessive work habits, indicating possible manic episodes. Even worse were the statements from people I'd considered friends. Mark from accounting described my paranoid questions about financial discrepancies. Sarah from HR mentioned my inappropriate emotional responses during staff meetings. Every interaction had been recontextualized, weaponized, turned into proof of my deteriorating mental state. But it was the video evidence that truly broke me. David had installed cameras in my office without my knowledge. Not security cameras, but personal recording devices hidden behind picture frames and inside decorative plants. He'd captured hours of footage, me talking to myself while working through problems, pacing when I was thinking, even crying the day our childhood dog had died. Out of context, the footage painted a picture of a man having conversations with invisible people, exhibiting compulsive behaviors, and breaking down under pressure. With context, it was just me being human in the privacy of my own office.
The financial records showed the true scope of David's preparation. He'd been slowly transferring company assets to accounts he controlled, always with plausible explanations: better interest rates, more secure banking, improved cash flow management. I'd signed every authorization, trusting his financial expertise, never suspecting that he was systematically positioning himself to cut me out entirely. The client communications were the final betrayal. For months, David had been having private conversations with our biggest accounts, subtly undermining my reputation while positioning himself as the stable, reliable partner. He'd shared confidential information about my health concerns, expressed worry about my decision-making capabilities, and gradually shifted all client relationships to run through him instead of me. I found myself admiring the thoroughness, even as it destroyed me. David hadn't acted impulsively or emotionally. This was a long-term, strategic campaign executed with military precision. He'd studied me like an enemy, identified my weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical accuracy. The most chilling realization was that every moment of affection, every shared memory, every brothers forever promise had been contaminated by his planning. While I'd been loving him unconditionally, he'd been cataloging my vulnerabilities for future use. By morning, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for my company, I was fighting for my reality, my sanity, my right to exist as the person I'd always believed myself to be. I cornered David in the parking garage at 6 a.m., before the building filled with witnesses to my supposed instability. He was sitting in his car, probably working up the courage to face another day of playing the concerned brother while wearing my crown. When he saw me approaching, something flickered across his face. Not fear, but annoyance, like I was a problem he'd thought he'd already solved. "We need to talk," I said, yanking open his passenger door. "Maybe you should call Dr. Morrison first," he replied, but he didn't drive away. Some part of him, maybe the part that still remembered being my little brother, wanted this confrontation. I slid into the seat beside him, and for a moment we sat in silence, breathing the same air in the enclosed space. The smell of his cologne was familiar, comforting in a way that made my chest ache with betrayal. "Why?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper.
David stared straight ahead at the concrete wall. "You wouldn't understand. Try me, please. I need to understand how someone I loved more than my own life could do this to me." That's when he finally turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd been blind to for years. Resentment so deep it had fossilized into hatred. "You really don't see it, do you?" he said. "Perfect big brother, golden child, the one who always had to be first at everything. David, that's not... You were 16 when you built our first computer. I was 14, but everyone always talked about your computer, your programming skills, your vision. I was just the little brother who helped." His voice was calm, matter of fact, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been screaming. "When we got the Forbes interview, they wanted to feature you as the CEO, the face of the company. I was listed as co-founder, in small print. When investors came calling, they shook your hand first, looked you in the eye when they talked about the future. I was furniture in my own company. I wanted to argue, to tell him how many times I'd insisted we were equal partners, how many interviews I'd redirected to include him, how many nights I'd stayed up worrying that he felt overshadowed. But the words died in my throat because maybe, in some terrible way, he was right. The matching tattoos were your idea. The Brothers Forever thing was your slogan. Even our rebellion against the world had to be orchestrated by you, didn't it? But you never meant to make me invisible, but you did. Every success story was about the brilliant older brother and his loyal assistant. Every article painted you as the genius and me as the support staff. I saw tears in his eyes now, but they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of rage. Years of accumulated fury finally finding release. So you decided to destroy me instead of talking to me about it? I decided to take what should have been mine all along. The recognition, the control, the respect. I decided to show everyone what happens when the golden child falls apart and the invisible brother has to save the day.
How do you forgive someone who spent decades hating you for loving them too much? Fighting someone who knows all your secrets is like boxing with your shadow. Every move you make has already been anticipated and countered. David had prepared for my legal response the same way he'd prepared for everything else, methodically and ruthlessly. My first lawyer quit after 3 days. David had somehow convinced him that I was experiencing a paranoid episode and that any legal action would be seen as proof of my instability. The second lawyer lasted a week before mysterious ethics complaints were filed against her. The third lawyer was the only one brave enough to tell me the truth. David had made me legally untouchable. "Your brother is a genius," she said, spreading documents across her conference table. "Evil, but a genius. He's created a situation where any attempt to fight back becomes evidence of the mental instability he's alleging." The restraining order came next. David claimed I'd been making threatening phone calls, sending harassing emails, showing up at the office in an agitated state. The judge, presented with 2 years of documented mental health concerns and recent evidence of erratic behavior, granted the order without even hearing my side. I was legally prohibited from going within 500 feet of my own company. That's when the real psychological warfare began. David started appearing everywhere I went. Restaurants where I tried to have business meetings, the gym where I worked out my rage, even the coffee shop near my apartment. He wasn't violating any laws. He was just living his life in the same city. But the message was clear. There was nowhere I could go to escape him. The press coverage began 2 weeks later. Anonymous sources close to the company leaked stories about my breakdown and David's heroic efforts to hold everything together during my crisis. The narrative was always the same. Concerned younger brother stepping up to save the company from his unstable siblings' destructive behavior. I watched our former friends and business associates choose sides in real time. Some quietly distanced themselves from me, not wanting to be associated with scandal. Others openly embraced David as the real brains behind our success, claiming they'd always known he was the more stable partner. The cruelest betrayal came from our old MIT roommate Jake, who'd been best man at David's wedding. He gave an interview to TechCrunch describing my increasingly erratic behavior over the past year, my paranoid accusations against David, and his relief that someone was finally getting me the help I needed. I called Jake that night, desperate to understand how someone who'd known me for 20 years could betray me so completely. "Come on, man," he said, his voice heavy with false compassion. "David showed us the videos. We're all worried about you. This isn't the friend I remember."
That's when I realized David hadn't just stolen my company. He'd stolen my history, my relationships, my entire social reality. He'd gone to everyone I cared about with carefully curated evidence of my deterioration, positioning himself as the concerned brother trying to help, while I was the dangerous variable that needed to be contained. I was being erased, not just professionally, but personally. David was rewriting our entire story, casting himself as the hero and me as the cautionary tale. The isolation was suffocating. Every morning I woke up in my empty apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had been systematically dismantled. Every evening I went to sleep knowing that tomorrow would bring new evidence of my disappearing existence. But something else was growing in the darkness of that isolation. A cold, calculating fury that David had taught me by example. If he wanted war, I would give him war. If he wanted to play psychological chess, I would learn to be a grandmaster. The old me would have been horrified by what I was about to become. But the old me had trusted his brother, believed in fairness, and played by rules that David had been breaking for years. The old me was dead, and what crawled out of that grave was something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. I hired a private investigator, not a lawyer this time, but someone who understood that truth and legality weren't always the same thing. Marcus Chen had worked corporate espionage for 20 years before going independent. He took one look at David's documentation and smiled the kind of smile that makes innocent people nervous. Your brother's good, but he's not invisible. Everyone leaves tracks if you know where to look. The first crack in David's perfect facade appeared in his financial records. He'd been careful to hide the money trail from lawyers and accountants, but he hadn't counted on someone who knew how to trace cryptocurrency transactions and offshore shell companies. For 2 years, David had been slowly bleeding money from our joint accounts into investments I'd never authorized. But the real gold mine was David's personal life. While he'd been busy destroying me, he'd gotten sloppy with his own secrets. The gambling addiction he'd hidden for 3 years, the cocaine habit that had started during our most stressful growth period, the woman he'd been seeing behind his wife's back, our former marketing director who'd mysteriously quit 6 months earlier. Marcus handed me a folder thick with evidence. Your brother's been living a double life longer than he's been planning yours, he said. Question is, what do you want to do with this? What I wanted was to destroy David the same way he had destroyed me, systematically, personally, and completely. I wanted him to feel the ground disappear beneath his feet, to watch his carefully constructed world crumble piece by piece.
I started with subtle moves, anonymous tips to his wife about unusual financial activity, leaked information to our investors about irregularities in company funds, carefully placed rumors about David's stress levels and concerning behaviors, all backed up by real evidence, unlike his manufactured case against me. The beautiful irony was that David had taught me exactly how to do this. I used his own playbook against him, documenting everything, building relationships with key people, creating a narrative of concern rather than accusation. The first sign that my strategy was working came when David's wife, Sarah, contacted me. She wanted to meet, she said. She had questions about their finances, about David's behavior, about whether the man she'd married was the person she thought he was. We met at a cafe across town, and I barely recognized the woman who'd been like a sister to me for 10 years. Sarah looked exhausted, confused, like someone who'd been living with a stranger and was just beginning to realize it. He's been different, she said, stirring her coffee with shaking hands. Secretive, paranoid, always checking his phone. He says it's because of your situation, but I'm starting to wonder if there's more to it. I showed her carefully selected pieces of evidence. Nothing that violated attorney-client privilege, nothing that could be traced back to my investigation, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, I said, and I meant it. Sarah was collateral damage in David's war against me, just as innocent as I'd been, but you deserve to know who you're married to.
As I watched understanding dawn in her eyes, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: power. For the first time since that Tuesday morning, I was the one holding the cards, the one controlling the narrative, the one deciding someone else's fate. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like becoming my brother. Sarah filed for divorce on a Thursday morning. By Thursday afternoon, David was standing in my hotel lobby, and for the first time in months, he looked as broken as I'd felt. "What did you tell her?" he demanded, his voice cracking like it used to when we were kids and he'd gotten in trouble. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "I told her the truth," I replied, "something you seem to have forgotten how to do."
"You don't understand what you've done. Sarah is everything to me. She's the only good thing in my life, the only reason any of this mattered." The irony would have been funny if it weren't so devastating. David had destroyed my life to save his ego, and now I'd destroyed his marriage to save mine. We were locked in a death spiral of mutual annihilation, each convinced the other deserved whatever pain we could inflict. "You took everything from me," I said. "My company, my reputation, my sanity. Did you think I'd just disappear quietly into whatever mental institution you had picked out? This is different. Sarah is innocent. She didn't do anything to you." "And what did I do to you, David? What did I ever do except love you and trust you and try to build something together?" That's when he finally broke down completely. 30 years of buried resentment, guilt, and self-hatred came pouring out in the hotel lobby while strangers pretended not to stare. "You were perfect," he sobbed. "You were always perfect, and I was always trying to catch up. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire life being someone's shadow? To be introduced as the other brother or the younger partner or the also co-founder?" I watched my little brother fall apart and felt my rage crack open to reveal something more complex underneath. Grief for both of us, for the relationship we'd destroyed, for the children we'd been before life taught us how to hurt each other. "I never wanted to be perfect," I said quietly. "I just wanted to be your brother. But you were so good at everything. School, business, people. Everyone loved you immediately. I had to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. And the worst part was that you never even noticed. You just assumed everyone saw what you saw, that everything came as easily to everyone as it came to you." For the first time, I tried to see our shared history through David's eyes. The times I'd been praised while he stood silently beside me. The interviews where journalists focused on my answers while barely acknowledging his presence. The investor meetings where handshakes and eye contact flowed naturally to me while he remained peripheral. I'd never meant to overshadow him, but intention doesn't erase impact. I'd been so focused on including him, on making sure he felt valued, that I'd never considered whether my very presence made that impossible. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "I'm sorry I made you feel invisible. I'm sorry I never saw how much you were hurting." "But David, what you did to me—" "I know what I did was wrong," he interrupted, "but I couldn't stop. Once it started, I couldn't find a way to back down without admitting everything. And then you fought back, and it became this thing neither of us could control." We stood there in that lobby, two middle-aged men crying over the ruins of a brotherhood that had died slowly over decades of accumulated wounds. I realized that David's betrayal hadn't happened overnight. It had been building since childhood, fed by every moment when I'd shined and he'd felt diminished. "Where do we go from here?" I asked.
David wiped his eyes and looked at me with something that might have been hope. "I don't know. Is there a way back from what we've done to each other?" The legal settlement took 6 months to negotiate. David kept the company. He'd poisoned it too thoroughly for me to ever return. But I got 40% of its value in cash and assets. More importantly, I got a public statement acknowledging that the mental health allegations had been fabricated, that I'd never been unstable or unfit to run our business. It was a Pyrrhic victory.
The money couldn't buy back my reputation, and the statement couldn't undo the damage to relationships that had taken decades to build. Some bridges, once burned, leave only ashes. Sarah's divorce was finalized around the same time. She moved back to California to live with her sister, taking nothing from David except her freedom. The house they'd built together sold within a month. Neither of them could bear to live with those memories. I started therapy with Dr. Rodriguez, a woman who specialized in family trauma and betrayal. She helped me understand that my relationship with David had been built on an unstable foundation. I'd been the protective older brother, trying to shield him from a world that naturally favored me, while he'd been the resentful younger brother, watching his identity disappear in my shadow. "You both confused love with control," she explained during one session. "You tried to control his pain by being responsible for his happiness. He tried to control his pain by destroying your happiness. Neither approach was sustainable." The hardest part was learning to separate the David I'd loved from the David who'd betrayed me. They weren't different people. They were the same person containing multitudes of capability for both love and destruction. Understanding that didn't excuse what he'd done, but it helped me process the complexity of grief I felt for our lost relationship. I threw myself into building something new, a consulting firm specializing in family business dynamics and conflict resolution. The irony wasn't lost on me, helping other families navigate the exact type of betrayal I experienced. But there was healing in turning my trauma into purpose, in using my hard-won wisdom to prevent other families from destroying each other. David's company struggled without me. He'd been so focused on removing me that he'd never developed the relationships or skills necessary to maintain our client base independently. Within a year, he'd lost 3 major accounts and had to lay off a quarter of the staff. I felt no satisfaction in his professional struggles. Revenge had taught me that destroying someone else's life doesn't repair your own. It just creates more wreckage. The last time I saw David was at our mother's 70th birthday party. We both came, neither wanting to disappoint her, both dreading the inevitable confrontation. But when we found ourselves alone in Mom's kitchen, washing dishes like we had as children, something had shifted between us.
"I've been going to therapy too," he said quietly, not looking at me. "Trying to understand how I became someone who could hurt the person I loved most." We worked in silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of washing and drying, creating a temporary peace between us. I realized this might be the last normal moment we'd ever share, and despite everything, I treasured it. "Do you ever think about that bike we shared?" I asked. David smiled sadly. "Every day. We were so proud of figuring out how to take turns, how to make it work for both of us. When did we forget how to do that?" I didn't have an answer. Maybe we'd never really learned how to share anything more complicated than a bicycle. Maybe the business world had taught us that there could only be one winner, and we'd internalized that lesson too completely. "I forgive you," I said finally, the words surprising both of us. "Not because you deserve it, but because I can't carry this anger anymore. It's poisoning everything I try to build." David set down the dish he was drying and looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but thank you. It means more than you know." We hugged then, not the performative embrace from that last Tuesday morning, but something real and raw and final. It was goodbye to the brothers we'd been, acknowledgement of the men we'd become, and a recognition that some damage is too deep to repair, but not too deep to survive. 3 years have passed since that Tuesday morning when David walked out of my life, taking everything I thought defined me. I'm sitting in my new office now, smaller than the empire we built together, but entirely mine, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and forgiveness. My consulting firm has helped 12 families avoid the same destruction David and I brought upon ourselves.
Each case teaches me something new about the complexity of family dynamics, about how love and resentment can grow intertwined like poisonous vines choking the same tree. There is a photo on my desk, not of David and me, but of the new team I've built. People who chose to work with me not because of blood or history, but because of what we could create together. It's a different kind of family, one built on mutual respect rather than inherited obligation. I still think about David every day, not with the white-hot rage that once consumed me or the deep grief that followed, but with a sort of distant sadness for what might have been. According to mutual friends, his company finally went under last year. He's working for a software firm now, just another middle manager in someone else's dream. Part of me wants to reach out to see if time has softened the sharp edges of our mutual destruction. But I've learned that some relationships are like broken glass. You can carefully piece them back together, but they'll never be safe to handle the same way again.
Dr. Rodriguez says I've moved through the stages of betrayal recovery remarkably well. Shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally, acceptance. What she doesn't mention is the stage that comes after acceptance. The strange liberation of realizing that your identity was never as fragile as you thought. Losing everything David and I built together taught me that I am not my achievements, not my reputation, not my relationships. I am the capacity to survive, to adapt, to rebuild from nothing but determination and stubborn hope. The irony is that David gave me something he never intended: freedom from the need to be perfect, to be loved, to be the golden child who made everyone else comfortable. In destroying my carefully constructed life, he forced me to discover who I was beneath all that performance. I've started dating again. Her name is Alina, and she's a divorce attorney who understands betrayal from a professional perspective. She knows my story, all of it, and sees me not as a victim or a survivor, but simply as a man learning how to trust again. "You're different from other clients I've worked with," she told me over dinner last week. "Most people who've been through what you experienced either become cynical or desperate. You've become careful but not closed." Maybe that's the best outcome I could have hoped for: to emerge from David's betrayal scarred but not bitter, cautious but not paralyzed, alone but not lonely. I've written him several letters over the years, long, rambling attempts to make sense of our shared history. I've never sent any of them. What would be the point? We've both said everything that matters, and some conversations end not because they're finished, but because they're complete. Tonight I'll go home to my apartment, smaller than the house I used to own, but filled with things I chose rather than things that impressed investors. I'll cook dinner for one without feeling sorry for myself. I'll read a book that has nothing to do with business or family dynamics. I'll sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow belongs entirely to me. This is what remains after betrayal strips away everything you thought you needed. The essential self, resilient and surprising in its capacity for renewal. David took my company, my reputation, my relationships, my sense of safety in the world. But he couldn't take my ability to begin again, to choose differently, to love more wisely. If you're watching this because someone you trusted has betrayed you, because your family has become your battlefield, because you're sitting in the wreckage of a relationship wondering how to move forward, know this: you are more than what happened to you. You are more than their perception of you. You are more than the worst thing that's been done to you. Healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving or returning to who you were before. Healing is about integrating the experience into a larger story about your capacity to survive, to grow, to become someone you couldn't have imagined being before the world broke you open.
Hit that like button if this story helped you feel less alone in your own struggles. Share your experience in the comments, not to seek advice, but to remind others that they're not the only ones carrying these kinds of scars. And subscribe, because there are more stories to tell about the beautiful, terrible complexity of human relationships and our endless capacity for both destruction and renewal. Thank you for listening to the hardest story I've ever had to tell. May you find your own way through whatever darkness you're facing, and may you emerge into a life that belongs entirely to you.